Hey friends, it's Alex from Vulture Culture, and welcome to Fundamentals of EQ. Today we're going to be talking about if you should turn up the bass in your car or not. Before we get started, please like this video if you find it helpful and subscribe to the channel if you want to see all of my Fundamentals of EQ tutorials. And in all of these tutorials I'm using ReEQ, which is the stock EQ plugin in Reaper, but you can use whatever plugin you'd like. So let's get started. So I'm making this video to prove a point about EQ into compression versus EQ out of compression. And car manufacturers learned a long time ago that we're not that good at not destroying our own speakers. So they've actually for a while now been putting a lot of post-processing into the audio signal path between your speakers and whatever your input source is, whether it's your cell phone or your car radio or whatever. And the reason they do this is because they want to make sure that you're not going to blow your speakers. It's actually pretty difficult to blow your speakers nowadays. So what I've done is I've routed all of the tracks into this separate master fader here, and I've set up what would be the type of post-processing that you would see in your car most likely. So the first thing is a crossover. And in your car, you probably have at least one crossover between your subwoofers and the rest of your speakers, your mid-range and tweeters. And you can see that as the song's playing, it's not causing anything to trigger these. Now, see, it's bouncing at like -0. And these are pretty hard ratio, 8-to-1, which is pretty aggressive. And that's designed so that if you turn up the bass too much, it won't let your speakers actually turn up much louder. And then I have this plugin from Waves, the vocal writer, but I'm actually just using it for the whole mix. And this is because most cars use levelers, and levelers are different than limiters. Limiters actually compress dramatically the signal that's being sent into them. Levelers just turn the volume down. And again, this is another way, sort of like a safety net to keep you from blowing your speakers. So they'll actually turn the volume down for you. You can see what it's doing here. It's keeping it around 0, but anything that's too loud, it's ducking. And that's pretty common in all cars. And then as a last resort, I have a recomp set up, and I have it sort of set up like a limiter. There's a little bit of pre-compression, so it'll clamp down on any transients. 0 attack and a fast release, and it's infinite ratio. So it's like a limiter, and you can see that it's not causing it to. Oh, it is a little. Sorry, I'll move this down to like -9. Okay. So now I'm going to add a ReEQ, and I'm going to set this low shelf to 200. I'm going to increase the bandwidth here to, on this to 3. I'm going to enable it, right? And then on the high shelf, I'm going to just bring it down to 1. So this is kind of emulating the type of EQ that you'd have in your car if you have a bass, mid, and treble. So what's going to happen here is if I crank this EQ into this processing, you'll hear what happens. So let's say we're in my car and I'm like, this song's cool, but I wish it had a little bit more bass in it. So let's say I crank the bass up, especially if I have some like really good subs. And then now that I've done that, I can't really hear a whole lot. So I'm going to crank the high end too. Now it should be pretty clear that doesn't even really sound that good. And the reason is because all of this processing is keeping this rider's doing a lot. And this is locking down on all the frequencies I'm doing too. So what's actually happening is I'm not really turning up that much. I'm actually just scooping out the middle here. But the difference is all of this processing is adding distortion, right? It really doesn't sound that good. But I know a lot of people who like crank their subwoofer and they crank their treble. So now I'm going to reset this and let you hear the song again without any of that. Now, to create the exact same effect, I'm actually just going to scoop out some of the mids. I'm not going to scoop out too much. But even if I wanted to, and I wanted to go a little aggressive, there's a lot of bass kicking through, and what's actually happening now is there's no compression happening here, so there's no artifacting audio loss. The rider's actually pushing my volume up. Now in a car it won't do that, but you can just turn the volume up further. And it's also not causing any artifacting or anything weird here. So comparing the two, you should be able to hear that this is much cleaner sounding, and the bass is boosted. And this makes a good point as to why you should usually try not to boost into compression. So whenever you're EQing, if you have a compressor or any sort of dynamics processing afterwards, if you're boosting into that, you're making the compressor work harder and therefore increasing artifacting and losing some audio quality potentially. The exception to this rule is actually if you're boosting high end, but volume matching. So if I was to play this back, and I want to crank the high end a lot, but I also bring the volume down, and see if this is about volume matched. I'm going to disable this for a second. Okay, that's a little, actually I need to put a little volume back in. That's probably about volume matched. Now, if you look at this graphical representation here, you can see that there's a lot of movement in this lower section and not as much up here. So what that means is that when you are cutting volume here, you're volume matching, which you should always do, but you're adding high end, which you can think of that as is I'm actually removing frequencies here. So even though it's additive EQ, because I'm volume matching, it's actually feeding less to the compressor, and you can see that there should be not even less. You can see this isn't even getting close anymore. So that's kind of the exception, is if you're boosting high end but you're volume matching, then you can do that into a compressor because you're actually sending it less signal. But most of the time when people are EQing, there might be, they might not be doing that. So, and that's it. Please like this video if you found it helpful, and subscribe to the channel if you want to see all of the fundamentals of EQ tutorials, and I'll see you in the next video.